Abandoned, she found shelter in an old barn, but what happened next changed everything. She was standing in the middle of that little dirt road with the sun settling far off in the rolling fields and two golden dogs sitting beside her, looking at her as if they knew exactly what she was feeling. The old barn ahead of her seemed frozen in time, the darkened wood, the roof sagging on one side. Everything there seemed tired, just like her. 3 days earlier, Sarah Mitchell had come home after a normal afternoon of work and found only a note on the kitchen table. It wasn't hard to read, just 2 lines. David had left. No destination written, no detailed explanation, not even an apology. Just those 2 lines that together undid 12 years of marriage in a single second. Sarah remembered standing there staring at the paper for so long that when she came back to herself, it was dark outside, and she had never turned on the light. The dogs, Cooper and Daisy, stayed by her side the entire night. They never moved, as if they understood that she needed weight beside her, warmth, something that would stay. The problem was that the house wasn't hers. It was rented in David's name, and he had arranged things with the landlord before leaving. The day after the note, the phone rang early. It was the landlord. Kind, but direct. She would need to move out within a week because the lease wasn't in her name and the property would be handed over. 1 week. 12 years of life. 1 week. Sarah was 46 years old. With blonde hair she kept long out of habit. A job at a fabric and textile shop that had closed its doors 2 months earlier because of the owner's debts and no family nearby. Her mother had passed a few years back. Her brother lived far away, with a life that didn't have much room for long visits. Her friends existed, but they were the kind of friends you text, not the kind who show up when it truly counts. With the money she had saved, she paid for 2 months at a boarding house near downtown. But she'd barely gotten there when she found out animals weren't allowed. Cooper and Daisy stayed outside while she climbed the stairs with her suitcase, and when she came back down, the 2 of them were sitting on the sidewalk, tails wagging slowly, waiting, as if they were saying, "Wherever you go, we go too." And she didn't have the heart to leave them, not at that moment, not after everything. So she got her money back, put the 2 suitcases in the trunk of the old car that was actually hers, with the 2 dogs in the back seat, and drove off with no destination in mind. She left town on a Wednesday afternoon. She passed through one small country town, then another, and kept following the dirt roads that appear when you leave the paved ones behind. That's how she ended up at that field. She had stopped the car on the shoulder when she saw the little road, and without thinking too much about it, she turned off the engine, got out, and started walking. Cooper and Daisy came down behind her, as always, and the 3 of them stood there, in front of the abandoned barn, while the sun sank into the horizon and turned everything the color of embers. Some things don't need a logical explanation. Sometimes a place speaks to us before we understand what we're hearing. Sarah looked at the barn and felt she needed to go inside. The front door was loose, held up more by the rusted hinges than by anything else. She pushed it carefully, and the sound it made echoed across the field like a long groan. Inside it smelled of damp wood and old straw. There was a pile of sacks in the corner, some tools hanging on the wall, a small high window where the last orange of the sky came through diagonally. Cooper sniffed every corner. Daisy stayed close to Sarah. She opened one of the suitcases, grabbed a blanket, and sat down on the packed dirt floor. She ate a piece of bread she had in the bag, gave a biscuit to each dog, and sat listening to the silence of the rolling fields outside. It was a silence different from the silence of an apartment, the kind that aches. This one was full. There were crickets, there was wind, there was the rustling of the golden grass outside. She slept in a way she hadn't slept in a long time. Deep. Without waking up in the middle of the night waiting to hear a key in the lock. When the sun came through the small window the next morning, Sarah lay there for a while, staring at the wooden planks of the ceiling, with Cooper nestled against her legs and Daisy on her belly, and thought that she was in a place that wasn't hers, sleeping on the floor of an old shed in the middle of a field she didn't even know the name of, with no job, no home, no husband. And for the first time in a long time, There was no one expecting anything from her. It wasn't a perfect relief, it was a strange mix of freedom and dread. But before she could get up and think about the next step, she heard footsteps outside. Heavy, slow, with a small cane tapping against the dirt. The barn door opened and a woman appeared. She must have been around 75, white hair pinned in a bun, a floral apron over a simple blouse, and the liveliest eyes Sarah had seen in a long time, eyes that didn't ask permission to look. The old woman took a good look at her, at the two dogs, at the open suitcase, at the blanket on the floor. "So you're the one who was in here last night," she said without raising her voice. "I saw the car lights before dark. Thought it was some boy from the small valley town drinking. Didn't expect a woman in a black dress with two golden dogs." Sarah stood up quickly, brushing off her clothes. I'm sorry, I didn't know it had an owner. I didn't know it. I didn't see anything indicating. I can leave right now." The old woman didn't answer immediately. She stood looking at Cooper, who walked over to her slowly, sniffing her hand. The woman lowered her hand and let the dog smell it. "This one here is calm," she said. "They both are," said Sarah. "They don't do any harm." The old woman looked up. "I wasn't talking about the dogs." Silence. "Mrs. Abigail Henderson," the woman said, extending her hand. Sarah shook it. "Sarah Mitchell." Mrs. Abigail looked around the barn, then looked at her again. "Did you eat anything besides that stale bread in that bag?" Sarah didn't answer, which was an answer in itself. "Come have breakfast," said the old woman, and she walked out without waiting. Mrs. Abigail's property sat about 200 yards behind the barn, an old farmstead house with a long porch, faded blue windows, an ancient oak tree at the entrance, and a chicken coop in the back. Inside it smelled of brewed coffee and hardwood. The walls had old photographs, shelves with little jars of spices, a wall clock ticking at a rhythm that seemed slower than normal. Sarah sat at the kitchen table. Mrs. Abigail set in front of her a plate with warm cheddar biscuits, a bowl of homemade butter and a glass of coffee with milk that would have been enough to fill 2 people. "Eat," said the old woman, and that was all. Sarah ate. Cooper and Daisy lay on the porch as if they already knew it was a safe place. While eating, Sarah looked around. There was a photo on the sideboard, large, framed, a young woman in a field, similar to the fields outside, with a man beside her smiling at the camera. She recognized the woman's eyes. It was Mrs. Abigail decades ago. "My husband," said the old woman without Sarah having asked, "passed away about 20 years ago. The farmstead was left to me. It must be hard taking care of all this by yourself." Mrs. Abigail gave a short smile. "I have help 3 times a week. A young man from the small valley town, but the farmstead used to be much bigger. I've been selling off plots over the years." She paused. "The barn was left because no one wanted to buy it with it. It's falling apart." "It's beautiful anyway," said Sarah, and she meant it. The old woman looked at her from the corner of her eye. "Why were you sleeping in an abandoned barn, Sarah?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she told her, not everything at once, but in pieces, like someone carefully pulling something out of herself because she knows it's going to hurt when it comes out. The note on the table, the dogs on the sidewalk outside the boarding house, the dirt road and the rolling fields, and the sun going down when she stopped the car. Mrs. Abigail Henderson listened to it all without interrupting. When Sarah finished, she was quiet for a good long while. Then she said, "Do you have somewhere to go now?" "I'll think of something." "That's not the same as having somewhere." It wasn't. Sarah didn't respond. "There's a room in the back," the old woman said. "I was using it for storage, but it has a bed, it has a window. If you want to stay a few days while you decide what you're going to do, you can stay." Sarah looked at her, searching for a hidden condition in the offer, because life had taught her that kindness like that almost always came with strings attached. But there was no trap in Mrs. Abigail Henderson's eyes. They were just old eyes that had seen too much to waste time on games. "Why are you offering me this?" Mrs. Abigail Henderson stood up, picked up the cups from the table, and carried them to the sink. She stood with her back turned for a moment before answering. "Because once I also needed a place to stay and no one offered me one." She turned around. "And I learned that's one of the worst feelings in the world. I'm not going to pass that on. Sarah stayed 3 days, then 7, then 15. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The adjustment wasn't immediate. Mrs. Abigail Henderson was a woman of few words and many silent expectations. She didn't need to speak when she wanted something done differently. A sidelong glance or a short sigh was enough. Sarah took a week to learn how to read those signs, but she was learning. She started helping in the kitchen, then in the chicken coop, and little by little she fell into the rhythm of the farmstead. She woke up early, had coffee with the old woman on the porch, took the dogs out to run through the rolling fields and came back to help with lunch. It was a simple routine Sarah hadn't had since she was a child, when she lived with her mother in a house out in the countryside. Some nights she would lie in bed in the little room in the back and listen to the farmstead breathing around her, and she would think about David. Not out of missing him, but with that question that lingers, where did it all start to fall apart? Sometimes she tried to locate the exact moment, like someone looking for a loose thread in a sweater, and she couldn't find it. It was as if the whole thing had unraveled from the inside, slowly, without her seeing it. It was one afternoon that everything changed direction. She was helping Mrs. Abigail Henderson organize some boxes in the guest room when she found at the bottom of one of them a bundle of letters tied with string. The old woman saw where Sarah was looking and stood still for a moment. "Leave it there," she said. Her voice was different, lower. Sarah put the letters back in the box without asking anything. But that night, at dinner, Mrs. Abigail Henderson was so quiet, she seemed to be somewhere else. The next day, as they peeled sweet potatoes on the porch, the old woman began to talk. She had married young, to a man her family chose, as was common in those days. It was a good choice, by the logic of those who made it. A man of means, a hard worker, respected in the small valley town. What no one told young Abigail was that a man respected in public could be a stranger inside his own home. Not that he hit her. He didn't hit her. It was worse. It was a constant coldness, a veiled control, a way of making her feel small within her own life. And when she got pregnant at 22, he got straight to the point. He didn't want children. He never had. And she had understood the opposite from the conversation they'd had before the wedding. The child was born. A girl. Her name was Catherine. Her husband never approached his daughter the way Abigail expected him to. He stayed distant, cold, as if the girl were an accepted inconvenience. And Abigail raised the child practically alone, inside a marriage that was a formality. When Catherine was 3 years old, Abigail discovered her husband had another life. It wasn't a passing fling. It was a woman in a nearby town, with whom he spent a good portion of the time he claimed to be handling business. Abigail kept looking at me while she told that part, and I had to stop blinking because I felt that tightness in the chest of someone who recognizes a pain from somewhere. She didn't leave, not because she didn't want to, but because in practical terms back then, a woman with a small child, no money of her own, no family nearby. Where would she go? The barn that stood out in the field today was the same barn that existed back then, and on more than one night, when the house became suffocating, she would go there, stand in the doorway, and stare out at the open field. "It was the only place where I felt outside that prison I had built myself," she said. "You didn't build it. They put you inside it." Mrs. Abigail kept staring at the paring knife in her hand, the half-peeled sweet potato. "Is there a difference?" "There's a big difference, Mrs. Abigail." The old woman didn't answer, but the way she lifted her head afterward made it clear that those words had reached somewhere. Mrs. Abigail's husband had passed many years before from a long illness the two of them endured in silence. The other woman disappeared as soon as it became clear there were no more possessions to enjoy. The daughter Catherine grew up, studied, moved to another state. She called every Sunday at 10 in the morning, without fail. But the farmstead, the house with the blue windows, the barn in the field, all of that belonged only to Abigail. "So you're alone here?" "I've been alone for 50 years, the old woman said without drama. "I only learned to like it in the last 20. Sarah was silent for a while. I'm 46 years old and I'm learning right now. Mrs. Abigail let out a low laugh, the first Sarah had heard. It was a good laugh from someone who truly finds something funny. It was that week that Sarah began to think about staying longer, not because she was afraid to leave, but because she felt there was something happening there, in that field of golden grass with that old woman in a flowered apron, that she needed to understand to the end. There was the room, there was food, there was the farmstead work she gradually took on, and there was a kind of conversation forming between her and Mrs. Abigail, slow like everything that is honest. But it was on the 22nd day that David's car appeared at the farmstead entrance. Sarah was on the porch with the 2 dogs when she heard the engine. Cooper raised his head first, ears perked. Daisy stayed quiet, but her snout worked. And when the car stopped and the door opened, Sarah stood up without realizing it. David was 48 years old, grey hair at the temples, and wore the expression of someone who had spent weeks rehearsing what he was going to say, and still wasn't sure of any of the words. He came up the stone walkway with his hands in his pockets, and when he saw Sarah on the porch, he stopped. "How did you find me?" she asked, steady voice, steadier than she expected. "Your brother. He knew about a farmstead in the countryside you had mentioned once." David looked around. "It took me a while to find the right small valley town." "What do you want?" He opened his hands. "To talk. There are things you don't know if you want to hear until you're right in front of them." Sarah kept looking at David and tried to find in herself some trace of that desire for everything to go back to the way it was. She searched and didn't find it, and that absence was at the same time a relief and a sadness. She came down from the porch. Cooper and Daisy went along. "You can speak here," she said. David looked at the dogs, looked at the farmstead, looked at her. "I made a mistake, Sarah. I know I made a mistake. I left in the most cowardly way there is, and not a day goes by that I don't think about it." "You left with someone?" Silence. "With someone," he confirmed, and then in a low voice, "It didn't last. It's over." Sarah felt something stir in her chest. It wasn't anger. It was almost pity, because she looked at David and saw a man who had traded 12 years for something that hadn't even lasted a month, and now he was back empty-handed. "And now what do you want?" "I want to try again, if you want to." She was quiet for a while. The wind stirred the grass off in the distance. Cooper rested his muzzle on her knee. "You left in a 2-line note," she said. "You didn't even look me in the eye to say you wanted to go." "I know. I ended up on the floor of an old barn in the middle of the rolling fields because I had nowhere to go." He closed his eyes. "David," she waited for him to open his eyes, "you didn't come here because you love me. You came because you found yourself alone and afraid, and those are very different things." He didn't deny it, and it was the most honest he could be. Mrs. Abigail Henderson appeared at the porch door at that moment with her usual cane and apron. She looked at David, then at Sarah, then back at David. "Will you be staying for dinner?" she asked, in a voice that made it perfectly clear it was a formal question, not an invitation. David looked at Sarah. She answered before he could. "He won't, Mrs. Abigail. He's leaving now." There was a long silence. David kept looking at her as if searching for some opening, any sign of hesitation, but she was standing on land that wasn't hers, 2 dogs at her side and an old woman on the porch, and she was more whole than she'd been in a long time. He must have seen that, because he didn't try again. "If you ever change your mind," he began. "If I ever do, I'll say so." A pause. "But I won't, David." He nodded, went back to the car, drove off down the dirt road without looking back. Sarah stood where she was, the afternoon sun on her blonde hair, the 2 dogs sitting beside her like a frame. She took a deep breath. For the first time it came out through her nose. Mrs. Abigail came down from the porch slowly, cane tapping the stone, and came to stand beside her. The 2 of them stood there watching the trail of dust the car had left on the road. "You did right," the old woman said. "I think so." "Don't think. You did." Dear listener, if you're enjoying this story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out since we're just getting started. Now, continuing. The week that followed was strange in a good way. It felt like something had passed, and the air was cleaner afterward. Sarah slept better, woke up clearer-headed. She began to think, truly think, about what would come next. Not with desperation, but with a different kind of attention, like someone planning a trip instead of fleeing a fire. She talked to her brother on the phone, a long conversation. He didn't know the extent of the situation, and when he found out, he was quiet on the other end for a long while. Then he asked what she needed. She said she was fine for now. And it was true. One Saturday morning, Mrs. Abigail called her in to talk in the living room. Something serious by the way she said it. Sarah sat in the chair across from her. The old woman stayed in her usual armchair, hands folded in her lap. "I need to tell you something I've been thinking about this week," she said. Sarah waited. "I'm 76 years old. Catherine isn't coming back here. Her life is somewhere else, and that's how it should be. This farmstead. It needs someone to care for it, as if it were their own. The young man from the small valley town does what he can, but he has a family, he has other obligations." Mrs. Abigail paused for a moment, as if weighing every word that came next. "You can stay here. Really stay, not as a guest. Like someone who helps me run this place alongside me, with a small but honest salary and a roof that's yours for as long as you want it." The old woman looked at her steadily. "I'm not doing charity. I'm making an offer. There's a difference." Sarah felt her throat tighten, not from sadness. It was that feeling that appears when something you needed badly arrives in a way you never expected. "Why me?" she managed to say. Mrs. Abigail gave that low laugh again. "Because you walked into my barn and didn't make a mess, and because you treated my fields with care before you knew they were mine, and because when that man came here looking for you, you stood your ground." A pause. "Those are qualities I've learned to value." Sarah stared at her hands for a moment. She thought about the 12 years of a marriage that had been unraveling from the inside without her noticing. She thought about the 2-line note. She thought about the barn floor and the silence of the field, and how that silence had been the first honest place she'd found in a long time. "I accept," she said. That afternoon, Sarah and Mrs. Abigail walked to the barn together. Not for any practical reason. They just went, the two of them, with Cooper and Daisy running ahead along the dirt path. When they got there, Sarah stood looking at the old structure, the dark wood, the roof that sagged on one side but still held. "Can it be fixed?" she asked. Mrs. Abigail looked at the barn with those lively eyes. "Almost anything can." It wasn't just an answer about the barn. They both knew that. The sun was setting again, painting the fields orange and gold just like that first night. Sarah stood on that little dirt road, the 2 dogs at her side, and felt that the place which had seemed like the end of something was, in truth, the beginning of something else. Not the life she'd planned, not with the people she'd once imagined, but a life that was hers in a way the previous one never had been. In the months that followed, the farmstead slowly began to change. The young man from the small valley town, Caleb, in his mid-20s with a strong arm for hard work, started coming around more often. Sarah learned more about the routine of the property, about the seasons in the fields, about what grew well in which soil. She learned from Mrs. Abigail how to make aged cheese, how to spot rain clouds by the smell of the air, how to mend wire fencing with her own hands. And she came to truly know Mrs. Abigail, not just the woman in the flowered apron with the cane, but the woman of the letters tied with twine at the bottom of the box. One night the old woman came into the living room with that bundle and set it on the table between them. "These are letters I never sent," she said. "To my husband, to my daughter, to myself. Some of them." Sarah didn't ask if she could read them. Mrs. Abigail didn't offer. "You carried those for how long?" "All my life." The old woman ran her hand over the bundle with the gentleness of someone touching something fragile. "There are things we keep because we don't know what to do with them. But one day you look and you see that keeping them was also a way of surviving." Sarah looked at that bundle of yellowed paper and thought that we hold on to the things we can't let go of, until one day we realize we've already let go without having to force it. That time sometimes does it for us. She thought about David, and she realized that when she thought of him in that moment, she didn't feel anything that hurt. It was a memory, nothing more, a part of the story that had been left behind. Catherine, Mrs. Abigail's daughter, came to visit during the holidays. She was a woman in her mid-50s, dark hair, with a direct manner like her mother. She stood looking at Sarah with that natural suspicion a child has when they arrive and find someone new in their father's or mother's life. But Mrs. Abigail didn't let it last long. On the second day of the visit, she called them both to the table and said, without beating around the bush, "Catherine, Sarah stayed here because I asked her to. Because this farmstead needs someone who cares, and because she cares, I hope you treat her with the respect she deserves." Catherine looked at her mother, then she looked at Sarah, and in a way that strongly reminded her of the old woman, she gave a small but honest smile and said, "My mother never asked for anything without good reason. If she chose you, I'm in." Those were good days. The farmstead full of voices, of food, of stories being told and listened to. Cooper and Daisy ran through the rolling fields all afternoon, with what seemed like doubled energy. On the last night before Catherine left, the three of them sat on the porch drinking tea, the fields dark out beyond, the stars thick in the sky, unpolluted by city lights. Catherine asked Sarah how she had imagined life would be at 46. Sarah actually thought about it before answering. Different, with more certainty, with less fracture. And now? She looked out at the fields, into the dark where she knew the barn stood, and where she knew the golden grass would be in the morning when the sun came back. Now I understand that the fracture is sometimes the place where the new thing enters. Mrs. Abigail Henderson, in her wicker chair, said nothing, but Sarah felt her gaze rest upon her with a weight that needed no words. When spring arrived, the barn got a new roof. Caleb helped, 2 neighbors joined in, and Sarah worked side by side with the men all day long, going up and down, carrying shingles, measuring wood. Mrs. Abigail Henderson stayed on the porch, supervising with her cane, giving her opinion on every detail without anyone asking, and everyone obeyed because she was right most of the time. At the end of the day, when the last nail was hammered and the roof was sealed, Sarah stood at the barn door looking inside. The light came in differently now, cleaner, the smell of new wood mixed with the old smell of the place. Cooper and Daisy went in before her, sniffing the new floor as if checking whether it passed inspection. Sarah went in too. She stood in the middle of the empty space and was quiet for a while. She thought about how she had gotten there, the 2-line note, the boarding house sidewalk, the little dirt road at the end of an afternoon she hadn't known was changing course. There are places we enter broken and leave different, not fixed, different, with another way of seeing yourself, of holding yourself up, of understanding what you need and what you can let go of. That old barn had been the first honest place she'd found in a long time. And now, with the new roof and the dogs on the dirt floor, it was more than that. It was the beginning of something she had built with her own hands. Slowly. With help, with work, with pain, with generosity received and given back. That was it. It wasn't what she had planned. It was better. End of story. Sarah had to be abandoned to find what was truly hers. Sometimes we don't build life the way we planned. We build it the way we need to, with what's left, with who stays, with what we decide to do with the ground we landed on. If this story touched you in any way, leave your comment down below. Tell me where you're watching from, what you thought of Sarah, what you thought of Mrs. Abigail Henderson. Do you think she did the right thing in turning down David? I really want to read your opinion. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you so much for the company until now.